In this tutorial, I want to show that we can use the same value property placeholders here, regardless of whether we're running in a live environment or our test environment. So in the last tutorial, we plugged in the live config properties, and these got substituted at runtime and placed into our attributes on our message printer import class. Now what we want to do is actually, rather than using the live config properties during our testing, we want some separate properties which are test specific. So our message printer name this time is just going to say test printer service, and the separator is going to be pluses rather than the @ signs. So how do we do that? Well, we can use a similar approach to that used in the application.xml file. We need to set up and define the property placeholder element. The only difference is going to be the location. So rather than the live config properties file, we're going to be using the test config properties file. So what we can do is actually copy this from our application.xml file and then go down to our test application.xml file and open that up. And then we can simply paste the element for property placeholder within our test application.xml file and rename it from live config properties to test, which then points to this property file. And it's just a case of running it as a unit test. So we go up to our JUnit message printer test, and that's good. We've got the green bar. And then if we look in the console output, we've got our output, which is saying test printer service, which is correct, the same as here in our properties file. And then we have the separator of 3 pluses. So that's all we need to do for our testing, but it's a powerful mechanism that we can actually separate different properties files for our live and also for our testing. And again, we can separate it out for our integration testing as well. Now, the next thing I want to look at is that if we want to move away, as we did in previous tutorials, from using the XML as our configuration, and we want to start using the Java config, how do we do that? How can we use the property placeholder in that situation? Well, again, it's fairly straightforward. Let's close some of these down, and we can go to our config file within our test environment and open up our test config Java file. So as you can see, we're using import resources. That delegates to our test application.xml file. So we could rely on this property placeholder element within our XML file, but we can also remove this. And within our test config, we can include a bean definition within our Java code rather than with our XML file. And that basically takes the form of a public static method, and the class name is property sources placeholder configurer. So that's the return type, and the method is going to be property placeholder configurer. And that's basically going to return a new instance of this guy, property sources placeholder configurer. And we've got a no argument constructor there, and do Control-Shift-O for the imports. And don't forget to include the bean annotation, and Control-Shift-O for the imports on that as well, and then save. Now, one other thing we need to include is an annotation to tell Spring that we're using the property placeholder configurer, and the annotation is actually property source. So we can select that. We include in that a value, and that value is going to have to equal class path. We want to search the class path for the file, and then followed by the folder of Spring /test-config.properties. And that's it. Rather than relying on the XML for the configuration for our property placeholder, we're now actually using the Java config configuration. And first of all, we've defined a bean definition using this property placeholder configurer method, which returns a new instance of property sources placeholder configurer. And then finally, we've annotated the configuration class with the property source annotation, giving it the value of the actual location for the test config properties file. So what we can do is rerun this unit test to check that it still works, which it has done. So down here we can see we've got test printer service and using the pluses, followed by a message of the day, and we have a green bar for successful JUnit run. That's it for externalizing bin configurations. In the next tutorial I'm going to start looking at resolving text messages, in particular support for internationalization, or I-18N for short.